Well, with that, thank you, Bonnie, for the introduction, and thank you, Karen, and the team at the Sarpy Chamber for the invitation to come and talk a little bit about two MAPA projects that we're really excited about. A lot of it builds on what Mayor Black just talked about thinking about the growth in Sarpy County and how we support that, and really tie it to what is MAPA's bread and butter, which is this federal transportation decision-making process. How do we use federal funds on projects that support our goals about growth and development and infrastructure needs in the entire region. But today we're going to focus that conversation here on Sarpy County. For those of you who may not be as familiar with MAPA, we are the Metropolitan Area Planning Agency. We are a regional council of governments, and so what that means is that we are formed by an interlocal agreement between 6 counties, Washington, Douglas, Sarpy, and Cass County on the Nebraska side, and Potawatomi and Mills County on the Iowa side. So we have a bi-state relationship. That means we get to work with state officials in 2 states. We get to learn 2 sets of rules. It's a wonderful place to be. But it is also really a forum for regional decision making. And it's because we exist as an interlocal organization that the United States Department of Transportation recognizes us as this metropolitan planning organization. And that organization really is a standing forum, kind of a group of local leaders that help prioritize federal transportation funding in the region and do the planning to support that. And that's really what a big part of our staff does. And really a big part of what we're going to talk about here today. So with that, so what I'm going to talk about today first is the planning and environmental linkages study for the new Sarpy County interchange. And so this is a project that's been out there for a long time, really thinking about how do we manage access to the interstate system and really provide more access to all the growth and development both on the residential side for new residents in Sarpy County, as well as supporting growth of industry. Mayor Black alluded to the real transformation of our regional economy around warehousing and distribution, a lot of speculative development in that area. How do we get out ahead of that if we can? And how do we really kind of support the locational advantage that we have here? And so, you hear the term planning and environmental linkages, you might think, what the heck does that mean? Well, I'm here to provide a little bit of background. Oftentimes when we do planning studies, we do really kind of broad-based community engagement. We think really big, we think really maybe imaginatively about what we want to accomplish. But oftentimes when we get into the process of using federal funds, we almost have to start over. We might have an idea, we might have a real concept for what we want to accomplish, and it may not be something that is a really good fit for federal funding. It may not be something that can actually navigate some of the regulatory hurdles that are in the federal process. And so the planning and environmental linkages framework was developed to provide a more streamlined and connected process between that planning. How do we do kind of broad visioning? How do we think maybe more flexibly about what we want to accomplish and how it ties to all these community goals, but then still carrying forward all of that work into that environmental decision-making process so that we're really saving effort, we're saving time, we're saving money for our local jurisdictions. And so the I-80 Planning and Environmental Linkages Study was really led by MAPA, but we were supported by partners at Sarpy County, the city of Gretna, and the city of Papillion, and really worked closely with NDOT to facilitate this process. And this was identified through a collaborative process that MAPA had with NDOT through the Metro Travel Improvement Study, a regional study thinking about the interstate needs, major roadway needs, and what we needed to do. And as part of that, we identified the potential for the need for an interchange on the I-80 corridor between Highway 370 and Highway 31. And so with that, this planning and environmental linkages studies is really kind of a planning effort that's very coordinated with federal leaders, with federal decision makers, with state decision makers to ensure that we're not kind of taking 2 steps forward and taking a step back along the process. And so you see here this windy road. Kudos to Craig Mielke at the bench for this enlightful graphic, but it really does provide us with a good framework for decision making, and we'll get into a little bit about what we accomplished in that study here today. So one of the things that we talk a lot about as part of spending federal dollars is the Nebraska, or the National Environmental Protection Act, or NEPA. It's really the formal process by which you're actually evaluating alternatives. You identify a need, maybe for a new roadway. You don't get to just pick what you do. You have to look at the universe of alternatives and narrow those down to what is actually reasonable and practical and preferred locally. And so the planning and environmental linkages study, which PEL there kind of comes before this process. It allows us to kind of think more broadly, think about what that universe of alternatives is, what are these forces, these changes that are occurring within the area of study, and then really kind of try to narrow down what we're considering through that formal process in NEPA. NEPA has a lot of regulations. It's kind of an umbrella of laws that apply from everything from parklands to stormwater to noise from transportation facilities. So there's a lot that we have to consider through that NEPA process. We want to narrow that and focus that through this planning process that we did collaboratively. So within that, one of the big pieces that Mayor Black alluded to is that there is a lot of growth and development happening in Sarpy County, and it's why starting with something like a planning and environmental linkages study was so important. There was a lot happening. There's a very high pace of change, and so if we got right into that NEPA decision-making process, things might change, they might impact what we're able to decide. So starting with kind of the overarching framework of what's going on, what policies are out there, where is growth and development going to occur, allowed us to have a better framework for evaluating how we actually look at different alternatives, different options for what we do along the interstate. And so one big piece of what we accomplished through the planning and environmental linkages study was looking at all of the comprehensive plans from the counties and the communities in this study area, and actually unifying, coming up with a more unified vision of what would happen if we had this interchange along this corridor. How would our communities prioritize land use? How would we think about all of the things that Mayor Black alluded to, not just thinking about it as new access, but really an entrance to these communities? How do we really kind of marry this kind of new access point along the interstate with these goals around placemaking, with these goals around having kind of coordinated development through all these communities? And so this was a really big effort of having a lot of local leaders come to the table and really work with us and our consultant team to understand how this growth and development would be impacted by the presence of an interchange. Some of the comprehensive plans forecasted that there would be a new interchange. Some of them had a very specific location, others did not. And so with that planning process, we were able to say, okay, this is a reasonable set of assumptions about where growth and development is going to occur with the new South Sarpy interchange and with the comprehensive plans that are going on locally. And so within the study area, we kind of took account for impacts throughout all of Southwest Sarpy County, but we were really looking at alternatives for a new interchange access between Highway N31 and 370. And this came from that MTIS study. As we looked out and we forecasted the growth and development that was going to be occurring in Sarpy County throughout the metro area, those interchanges as they're designed today would not perform to the level that we wanted them to. So there would be kind of peak traffic congestion, and really even with improvements to those interchanges, it appeared as though an additional interchange access point along the interstate would be warranted. So that's really the nexus of this study. And as we got into the sort of evaluation, we were looking for what are these alternatives that we want to evaluate through this process. And you see those here. The one piece here that we also incorporated Flug Road into the study, so that's actually kind of outside of that, just because of really kind of the alignment and the spacing of alternatives and making sure that we had a real comprehensive look at this interstate corridor all the way down to the Platte River. So you see there 168th and Schramm, 180th Street, 192nd and Cape Park, 204th and Fairview, Clappy Road, and Flug Road were the sort of universe of potential locations, kind of general locations that we evaluated through this particular study. And so you may be asking, well, how do we actually evaluate these types of interchanges? Well, we do that through developing what's called purpose and need. So the purpose and need statement is really, why you're doing something, and then demonstrating with data why that thing that you're trying to do is supported. And so through this process, we developed what we called both performance criteria, kind of traditional transportation measures, things that we use to evaluate transportation projects, whether it's a new roadway or transit or a new interchange, as well as acceptance criteria, what we hear from the community, what we hear from local stakeholders about these priorities, and how those two things work together. And so you see here on this slide highlights some of the performance criteria. As we looked at the purpose and need, that first need, really kind of look at those two interchanges. How can we improve the traffic operations at those locations as we see traffic growth into the future? And then also provide regional connectivity to I-80. So this is really thinking about that growth that's occurring. Is access sufficient, or do we need more access along I-80 to support the growth of these industries and to provide homeowners with a reasonable travel time throughout the metro area? And so then also you see that goal there, we didn't identify it as a need because we didn't have some of the data to evaluate it in particular, but we did note that with warehousing and distribution, you see the Amazon facilities here along Highway 50 as well. With that growth and all the speculative development in that area, we wanted to make sure that freight was accounted for as well. So we took those purpose and need statements, and we took those goals and we translated those into things that are kind of traditional transportation measures. You see those here, looking at volumes on 370, looking at volumes on Highway 31, looking at vehicle miles traveled, so kind of trying to ensure that we're either reducing or mitigating the growth in vehicle miles traveled, as well as reducing congestion or kind of time spent in vehicles as well. And then as much as we can, really kind of taking that thread of freight and making sure that it was sort of central to how we evaluated things as well. On the acceptance side, we had other goals. So we had goals about really trying to look at where growth and development was already in the queue, supporting that, and really trying to look at those comprehensive plans as a way of really helping us prioritize where access might be more warranted in the future as well. We wanted to encourage that economic vitality in placemaking. This isn't just a transportation point as that kind of entrance to communities in Southwest Sarpy County. We wanted to make sure that there was that opportunity to really take into account not just aesthetics, but where that connectivity should happen, where that logical entrance point to communities is. And then also fostering environmental sustainability, that umbrella of regulations. We wanted to make sure that we were taking into account the potential impacts of a transportation investment along this corridor, making sure that that was weighed against the actual potential federal action. And then also really looking for these opportunities for multimodal connectivity. Mayor Black highlighted Papillion's commitment to this regional trail network. Are there opportunities to build those kinds of features into this project as we build out not just the interchange and thinking about that as a potential barrier for multimodal connectivity, but also thinking about then the connected road network. What does this do for the rest of Sarpy County and access, and how can we build in transportation options for all users? So these criteria that we came up with were really around, benefiting municipalities. Does this actually help implement the land use policy that those communities have prioritized? Does it support kind of economic growth and activity throughout the community from really a very broad perspective? Minimizing environmental impacts, so really thinking about this kind of landscape of what those potential environmental features might be that might be impacted by these alternatives, and then also accommodating the multimodal transportation and incorporating it as much as possible. So how did we learn about these acceptance criteria? Well, we did a pretty significant amount of public involvement. We did it in two large phases. One of those was really at the beginning of the study, where we said, we're looking at a new interchange. What are your concerns? What are the things that you want us to consider throughout this process? That's where a lot of those things around purpose and need came from. People concerned about the changes to the corridor, people wanting to have access and kind of being relieved of congestion that they feel they're already experiencing today. In addition to really supporting industry. Those were kind of things that we heard early on, making sure that we accommodated all of those things in our study. When we got to the second round of public engagement, it was on those actual alternatives. So we gave people the opportunity to weigh in and provide comments for all of those locations that we identified as potential locations for an interchange along the corridor. We heard really kind of wildly different things. People concerned about where they actually get on the interstate today and what this might provide as a more convenient option, impacts to businesses and other sort of facilities and things along the I-80 corridor today, in addition to really just supporting the project overall. And so what this gave us was really the ability then to plot both of those transportation performance criteria against those acceptance criteria and help us understand where the opportunities to provide some level of priority to these alternatives might be through this process. While in some instances we can get down to a preferred alternative through a PEL study, that isn't what we have here today. We actually have what we're calling reasonable alternatives to carry forward. And this was an important piece of getting to that reasonableness. Are we actually threading the needle of purpose and need? Is it a warranted option to consider going forward? And is there general public acceptance of where this location has been identified? And so you see here on this plot, kind of to the right and to the top of the page are higher priorities in both those performance criteria and those acceptance criteria. You see 192nd in Cape Park performing the highest, and then 168th in Shram being the second highest. The note there is that we anticipate and we're carrying it forward as a reasonable alternative because we believe that there are some things that we don't know enough about yet that might mitigate that and move that higher up on that chart as well. So with that, getting into kind of even a more technical, and sorry here that the table is formatting is not working quite as well. You're actually not able to see 192nd in Cape Park there or 168th in Shram at the bottom of the page. But this table here really kind of took all those transportation aspects, all those performance aspects and acceptance aspects, and put them in a table for us to help decide which are the reasonable alternatives to carry forward. And along that far right column here, you see that there's a reasonable alternative at 192nd and K Park, as well as 168th Street in Tram. We kind of weighed these options and tried to kind of provide a little bit of a sense of how do we sort of support this decision-making process, how do we narrow our focus going into the next phase of the project, but still carry forward enough information and enough alternatives where we don't have enough information today into that next process. And so you'll see that one of the things that I haven't touched on before is the NDOT space in that first column there on your left. And what that is about is a memo that we received from NDOT about maintaining a 2-mile spacing for interchanges along the corridor. So thinking back to that map of where I showed the various locations where an existing interchange is today, that 2-mile spacing did limit some alternatives to help support and implement that NDOT policy about access as well. So you see here, this is kind of a high level, but that reasonableness piece is really about, is it worth considering going forward? Are there places where we might feel this duplicates, where there are unmitigatable environmental impacts, where there are other issues that we think, or other impacts that we think might be too extreme for what we're trying to accomplish, what the purpose and need is actually trying to and seeking to accomplish, as well as all those public involvement pieces as well. So the final report was submitted to our partners at NDOT and FHWA, Federal Administration in December. FHWA provided us with an acceptance of this study as a planning and environmental linkages study in February, early February. And so that kind of culminates the planning process. And so in that final report, we show really this whole process, this whole arc of how we're supporting transportation decision making, how we're weighing all of these various aspects of planning and development and growth in Sarpy County, and how we're narrowing then our scope of what we're going to be evaluating in that federal process going forward. So those two alternatives, those two reasonable alternatives that you see here on that kind of table in the middle, 168th Street and Tram generally, and 192nd Street and K Park, are kind of the general impact locations that will be carried forward. As we culminate this planning effort, we actually get into the next phase of the project, which is kind of the work leading up to an interchange justification report. So you may be asking, I thought you just spent a whole 10, 15 minutes talking about how the interchange is justified. Well, we did from the local perspective. The interstate is actually managed as a federal resource. So you think about I-80, it's a connection from the East Coast to the West Coast. Federal Highway Administration and U.S. Department of Transportation, they view that as a national resource. So changes to access at the local level, changes to existing interchanges, removing an interchange, that's something that actually has to be approved at the federal level. So this interchange justification report is really a very technical, very narrow sort of summary of what's in the planning and environmental linkages study to say, yes, we did all of this work, we're carrying this forward in an actual formal request to continue this process. So after that interchange justification report kicks off here over the summer, with NDOT kind of helping lead the development of the early materials for that, there will be another phase of this project once that interchange justification report has been approved into kind of engineering and MAPA and all the things that carry forward. So we're not doing this tomorrow. The federal transportation decision-making process is a very deliberative process. There's a lot of hoops to jump through. But over the next few years, you'll continue to hear and see kind of progress towards this. There will be more kind of partnership and coordination with our partners at the local level, carrying forward this specific aspect of kind of the transportation system in Sarpy County. But on your agenda today, you know that that's not the only thing that I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk a little bit about how we carry forward the rest of that work and really kind of thinking about the regional partnership that Mayor Black alluded to, how we think about that from a transportation planning perspective. I don't see Paula here today, but Paula Dennison over at the City of Gretna has all the credit for this wonderful acronym of WESTEP. And so Western Sarpy County Transportation Enhancement Plan is really about aligning policy at the local level for the cities of Gretna, cities of Papillion and Springfield, as well as Sarpy County about this growth area. As we start to build the infrastructure to support all the growth and development with the Southwest Sarpy Sewer Project, how do we make sure that that character between the communities, that the policies at the local level, and ultimately the funding model for those improvements is unified across these communities, and making sure that we have a very stepwise process to approach that as new things like the interchange are considered as well. So the WESTEP goals, I've kind of pulled these out of the recent RFP for this, but really kind of taking the transportation plans and comprehensive plans of the community, taking the work work that we did through the PEL process and helping translate that into a local policy. And that being really kind of prioritizing where future improvements to the arterial and collector street network need to be, having a unified set of local policies and standards for those arterials and collectors. So the collector in Papillion looks the same as the collector in Springfield's jurisdiction and the same in Gretna's jurisdiction. And then also coming up with these typologies. So not every sort of major roadway is the same throughout its entire life. On a more rural section, we might take one approach to it. Within the heart of a community like 84th Street in downtown Papillion, we might take a different approach. We might have other factors that we're wearing. So these street typologies really build in that notion of complete streets, taking the context of land use and development and matching that with the transportation system that we're providing with it. And then also really making sure that we're focusing on all of these kind of broad regional goals that we have for our transportation planning process, that we're thinking about safety, that we're thinking about inclusivity, that we're thinking about sustainability throughout all these threads, and that we're coming up with some really core and unified recommendations across all of these communities in Sarpy County. So WeStep, again, a very similar study area to the planning and environmental linkages study. You see here the planning boundaries of the various communities today with that growth and boundary agreement that Mayor Black alluded to. There's a kind of a formal process for how these decisions get made and why it impresses us as a very important piece of getting these policies aligned as those projects come online. For those of you who are careful watchers, there's a lot of things going on in Sarpy County already with transportation, and I'll allude to those on the next step. But we're anticipating kicking this project off in June. Hopefully having it completed within a 12-month period. A lot of work has already been done, and we're really trying to just make some of these key decisions along the way about what we want to accomplish. And we'll be convening both a steering committee of kind of like policymakers and a technical advisory group of local stakeholders, decision makers at the local level to help us understand how we can actually weigh these different factors and come up with some unified recommendations. There'll be stakeholder and public engagement throughout the process as well over that period, as well as presentations to the various city councils and county board as well. We'll be maintaining, similar to what we did for the planning and environmental linkages study, a project website that will keep people updated as well. And so again, as I mentioned, there's a lot of projects going on in Sarpy County already. Sarpy and the work that Sarpy County is leading to really get out ahead of some of the growth and development and trying to have some of these transportation projects online as development is occurring is already going on, taking into account the 204th Street and Cape Park improvements, the Platteview Road Expressway project that Sarpy County is leading in coordination with many of the communities in Sarpy County, as well as 108th and Platteview. And as I noted before, our planning and environmental linkages study is kind of a broad framework for this. There's other planning studies going on in Sarpy County as well, so in addition to that 156th Street sub-area study as well. You've heard enough about studies and transportation and all of that, and I really appreciate your time and attention today. Thanks again to Karen and her team here for the invitation. And I'm available here to talk about this. Craig is here as well. I don't see his jacket, but there it is. Craig's here as well if you have questions about the PEL study, but thank you again for the opportunity to speak to this group.